My name is Ralph Nader, and I have the privilege of introducing Jamie Fly at tonight's panel. Mr. Fly has served as the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative since its founding in 2009. This nonprofit, nonpartisan organization promotes the active engagement of the U.S. in global politics through economic, diplomatic, and military policies. Prior to joining the Foreign Policy Initiative, Mr. Fly served in the Bush administration at the National Security Council and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He was the Director for Counterproliferation Strategy at the National Security Council, focused on Syria, the Iranian nuclear program, missile defense, chemical weapons, and other counterproliferation issues. For his work in the Department of Defense, he was awarded the Office of the Secretary of Defense Medal for exceptional public service. After meeting Mr. Fly and providing a short tour of campus, I learned that this trip is his first to Oregon. Sadly, he only has the pleasure of enjoying our beautiful campus and stayed for the day. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Jamie Fly to the podium.
And it is my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Mr. Ralph Nader. He is a 6-time U.S. presidential candidate, an influential figure in both humanitarian and environmental affairs. He has also inspired the creation of over 40 nonprofit organizations. In addition, he has worked to promote democratic governance and consumer protection. Today I learned that Mr. Nader's favorite ice cream flavor is chocolate, and he also enjoys eating broccoli. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ralph Nader to the podium.
Introduction to follow, but thank you to the students who have organized this year's symposium for including me. A decade ago, organized a similar symposium at my alma mater, my grad program at Georgetown, so I know all the hard work and long hours that go into organizing these sorts of things. I'm also somewhat humbled to be included on the stage tonight with Mr. Nader. I'm sure you all came to hear Jamie Fly debate this rather unknown person. And I saw my father yesterday in Pennsylvania over the holiday weekend, and I told him I was going to be debating Mr. Nader, and he said that when he was in college in the early 70s, that Mr. Nader came and spoke at his school, which was years before I was even born. So we'll see how this goes. I plead with Mr. Nader not to take advantage of my relative youth and inexperience, or the jet lag that I'm currently experiencing after flying into D.C. today. Hopefully I won't have a Rick Perry moment halfway through the day. On the serious subject, we've been tasked to talk about the future of military force and international peace and security. It's a rather broad topic, and I'll give you my general take, and then I'm sure we'll get into a variety of different countries and other issues that come up. Although I think I'm going to be more of a proponent for the future of military force probably than Mr. Nader, even I would never argue that military force is the only tool in America's toolbox, and I would certainly support, and certainly the work I do in Washington tries to support a better balancing, where possible, of the variety of tools that the American government has. When I think about this topic, I basically look at what it says about America's role in the world, and really about the question of intervention, which I think we certainly see this debate right now in the American political context. How often does America stand by and watch the world's problems unfold, or when should we and when do we act and attempt to make a difference? Are we willing to even continue our leadership role in the world? These are the sorts of questions that I certainly hear from a lot of members of Congress, people from both parties. I talk to a lot of people both on the right and the left who are asking these sorts of questions right now. And I actually think it was interesting when I was looking at Mr. Nader's recent writings on this topic, I actually wondered whether I was debating Ron Paul or Ralph Nader, because There is a certain sense of agreement, I think, on both the left and right sides of the spectrum about some of these basic concerns about the U.S. role in the world and the appropriate use of military force. I'll try to argue tonight in favor of what I believe is also a bipartisan view, that is in favor of an interventionist foreign policy that fully embodies what former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright once termed our role as the world's indispensable nation. And if it comes to it, as much as it will give me some displeasure, I'll even defend the Obama administration from Mr. Nader's, what I assume will be withering attacks on some of their policies. So I do think, despite that I have a lot of criticism of the Obama administration, I think they've done a lot of things right in the foreign policy arena. So people are even asking this question today for a variety of reasons. It's because of our financial crisis here at home, the state of our economy. They're also looking at changing global landscape as countries like China and India rise and other powers, Turkey, Brazil, and others also come to the forefront. But I strongly believe that despite our economic woes at home, despite what may be, in the case of many people, the frustration about U.S. foreign policy over the last decade, that U.S. military force can and should be used as a force for good in the world. I believe this in part because of some of my personal experiences. I visited Afghanistan for the first time last October, and on that trip I was able to spend a number of days out in the field with some of our amazing soldiers and Marines in places like Kandahar and Helmand. They are at the forefront of implementing what many people back here in the States sometimes dismiss as unnecessary or imprudent so-called nation building. But the reality is what they've achieved on the ground since President Obama sent his surge of forces that he announced in December 2009 has been truly remarkable. There are cities and towns that previously were unsafe for their own inhabitants under the rule of the Taliban. I saw it firsthand. They're now bustling hubs of commerce. Young boys and girls ran up to the Marines I was with in Helmand on the street, roughhousing with them and noting that it was they who had provided this new life that these young children could now experience. It was really moving to see this real-time fruit of American power in person. I also have, over the last several years, had the pleasure of visiting what is now a free nascent democracy in Iraq, in particular areas, especially in the north. In Kurdistan, business is booming. Iraqis, once they realize you're an American, will just come up to you on the street and just thank you for their liberation. And I think the real question is, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan to a certain extent, is whether we're going to squander the progress that we've made in a race for the exits, as we've already done in the case of Iraq, and it's just a question of how much political influence we're able to exert in the years ahead. So American military power has often been and will continue to be a force for good in the world. And whenever I think about this, it brings to mind, for me, a quote from former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who talked about the variety of theaters we sent U.S. forces to, whether it was to World War II, to Korea, or even the deterrent effect of the Cold War. And he said, when all these conflicts were over, what did we do? Did we stay and conquer? Did we say, okay, we defeated Germany, now Germany belongs to us. We defeated Japan, so Japan belongs to us. No. What did we do? We built them up. We gave them democratic systems, which they've embraced totally to their soul. And did we ask for any lands? No. The only land we ever asked for was enough land to bury our dead. And that is the kind of nation we are. I think that the heart of my argument is that when you look at what American grand strategy is all about, I think the grand strategy that we've pursued, that has been pursued by presidents of both political parties, reflects the kind of nation we are. Although it may not be a popular notion, especially in tough economic times, the fact of the matter is that we are an interventionist nation. We can't escape it, it's just a fact. One of my colleagues back in Washington, Scholar Robert Kagan, actually has looked at the number of times we've intervened overseas, and he found that we've undertaken 25 overseas interventions since 1898, which averages out to be roughly one every 4.5 years, and one every 2.5 since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And again, it's important to remember that these are interventions by administrations of both political parties, not just the George W. Bush administration, or not just Republicans. It's been a bipartisan policy. So we can't escape these facts, and I think it's very important important to note that we are a nation that embodies our values even in how we go to war, which I think that makes us very unique compared to the enemies we have faced and the enemies we will continue to face in the decades to come. We are, as Secretary Powell said, the kind of nation that leaves places better than we found them, freeing people from tyranny in Afghanistan or Iraq, or more recently in Libya, just as our forefathers did in previous wars, giving women and children opportunities that they could previously only dream of, helping others to live up to their full potential, and to exercise the basic freedoms and rights. Senator Marco Rubio is someone I highly respect. I think is a rising star in Washington. In his opening Senate floor speech last year, said it this way. He said, "Most great powers have used their strength to conquer, but America is different. For us, our power always has come with a sense that to those that much is given, much is expected. A sense that with the blessings that God bestowed upon this land came the responsibility to make the world a better place." And I think, again, despite the current frustrations, I think most Americans inherently understand this, because I think it's ingrained in our very being that this is the type of people we are as Americans. The fact that we are even having this sort of debate, or this is a debate that I often have many times with both my friends on the right and the left, I do think there's obviously been some distance put between us and the terrorist attack September 11, 2001, which I think for many of us crystallized this sort of worldview. We are having a debate right now in Washington about the appropriate size of the U.S. military and funding levels for the defense budget. But I think to a certain extent, that debate, domestic debate here in the U.S. has been somewhat skewed. I'm very concerned about the trend, especially on the right, towards isolationism, which leads me to mention that I was surprised that Mr. Nader's views are so similar to Ron Paul's. So I do think, at least the way we see this manifesting itself on the right is a relatively new development. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at our military and you look at just the facts, there are a lot of the furor that you commonly hear about the role of the U.S. military, the U.S. military-industrial complex, I think are overblown. The fact of the matter is that defense spending is not driving our current deficit. It's our ballooning entitlements, which very few political figures in Washington are willing to address. If you look at the actual defense spending as a percentage of GDP, it's actually on target to reach its lowest point since the end of World War II. And we're currently facing what's called sequestration in Washington, that if enacted would add another $500 billion in defense cuts over the next 10 years, leading this Democratic Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, to say that would cause the U.S. military to have the smallest ground forces since 1940, the smallest Navy since 1915, and the smallest tactical fighter force in the history of the Air Force. People also often throw out statistics noting that we spend more than the next 10 countries combined, but they fail to note that China, for instance, a rising power, is rapidly increasing its defense budget. As we're cutting, the Chinese government claims that it's increasing its defense budget by 10% this year. The actual amount is probably much more significant. And The Economist recently noted that by 2025, China's military spending would most likely outsize that of the United States. So just given these basic facts, despite my concern about where some of the debate is headed, I do think that in the end, although we may draw down and we may reduce the military budget a bit, I think in the end we're going to come back to that same conclusion that I said up front has been followed by several administrations of both political parties, that a willingness to intervene, to take a stand for our values, represents who we are as a people. I'm sure that Mr. Nader tonight may try to argue, as again some on the right do, that we've wandered from the path set out by our founding fathers, some of whom certainly counseled caution when it came to entangling alliances with the rest of the world. We'll probably hear that frequent interventions and efforts to instill democracy abroad are the notions of starry-eyed humanitarians or warmongering neocons, greedy for oil and profit. But I think if you just look at American history, certainly the newly formed United States of America was in a very different place geopolitically than where the current United States is. But I don't think, if you just look at our founding documents and the principles that they represented, that those men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776, who basically were committing treason against the crown, meant the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," to somehow apply to only those 13 tiny colonies at only that time. Thomas Paine, writing around the same time, made the comment that the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind, and I think that's very representative of their thinking at that time of our nation's founding. So the intervention in this foreign policy I'm talking about and advocating is, I'd say, it's not a conservative foreign policy. It's not a liberal foreign policy. And it is a bipartisan foreign policy, from John F. Kennedy, Truman, back to FDR, and even President Obama today, in at times I would argue a delayed and bungled way, has pursued a similar policy and a very inherently American foreign policy. So we cannot escape our destiny in this history, and we remain the world's sole superpower, whether we like it or not. And as Senator Rubio said, with power comes responsibility. This does not mean that we need to intervene militarily in response to every crisis, but we must understand that when possible and when our strategic interests align with our moral interests, as they often do, we have a responsibility to act. I would look no further than the current case that we're seeing in Syria, as you have, by UN accounts, upwards of 10,000 people who have now been killed over the last year, tens of thousands of people more, beyond that in jail, and the strategic case that you can make for intervention in Syria, I'd argue, is much greater than that for Libya. The moral humanitarian case is basically the same, if not greater now in Syria, too, because of the death toll. These are cases, and even President Obama has noted the strategic importance of what happens in Syria to our policy vis-a-vis Iran and others. These are the very real cases that we need to be examining, and I personally believe that we should be getting more involved. Now, having said that, we need to balance our military actions with robust international assistance, foreign aid, and that's something I also focus a lot of attention on in Washington, because unfortunately foreign aid is being slashed as well in the current climate. Because using those sorts of tools, diplomatic and other tools, we can better head off a lot of the challenges before it gets to the point where we actually need to intervene militarily. Just look at what has happened in failed states now, like Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, where we're left with a very bad set of options that have no good answers. So I'll end maybe by just citing a Brit. I don't think eloquence is necessarily an American trait, but I think it might be a British one. Churchill, speaking in September 1943, when he received an honorary degree at Harvard, put it this way. He said, "The price of greatness is responsibility. If the people of the United States had continued in a mediocre station, struggling with the wilderness, absorbed in their own affairs, and a factor of no consequence in the movement of the world, they might have remained forgotten and undisturbed beyond the protecting oceans. But one cannot rise to be, in many ways, the leading community in the civilized world without being involved in its problems, without being convulsed by its agonies and inspired by its causes. If this has been proved in the past, as it has been, it will become indisputable in the future. The people of the United States cannot escape world responsibility." I think our U.S. military, certainly over the last decade, has been accepting that mantle of responsibility that many of our political leaders are trying to shirk at this point. And I think certainly if you talk to our men and women in uniform, as I did when I've been in some of these places like Afghanistan, they understand why they're there. They talk about the successes that they've been able to achieve in places like Helmand and Kandahar, and the impact that they're having, because otherwise they wouldn't want to be there. They wouldn't actually want to pursue these goals. There was recently a moving letter written by a young Marine, Sergeant William Stacy, actually from Washington State. Our commander in Afghanistan, General John Allen, cited it when he testified in front of Congress several weeks ago about the mission there. And Sergeant William Stacy died several months ago, but he left a letter behind to be read by his family in the event that he actually was killed in combat. And he said in this letter, "There will be a child who will live because men left the security they enjoyed in their home country to come to his. And this child will learn in the new schools that have been built. He will walk the streets not worried about whether or not his leader's henchmen are going to come and kidnap him. He will grow into a fine man who will pursue every opportunity his heart can desire. He will have the gift of freedom, which I have enjoyed for too long. If my life buys the safety of a child who will one day change this world, then I know that it was all worth it." And like I said, the Marines and the soldiers I met certainly believed that their mission was worth it. And I think that despite, again, our current concerns here at home about a lot of our foreign policy and our inwardly focused domestic debate, I think we need to remember that it is, in the end, worth it. Like most Americans, I don't want to see endless war, and I don't want the Americans of my children's generation to be having to patrol the Hindu Kush like Sergeant Stacy and the soldiers that I met in Afghanistan. But if our national security demands it in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, I think that's what we need to do, and I'm confident that our leaders of both political parties, like their predecessors over the last century, will ensure that we continue to accept that mantle of responsibility and, when necessary, to intervene, realizing that U.S. military power has been and can be a force for good in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy, you can take your 25 minutes. I'll take the rest. With your permission. We'll have 25 minutes each, and open it up for discussion. I too want to express my appreciation for the students. It is a lot of work to put on an event like this, especially with 50 years of tradition behind it, lifting up people's sense of expectation. And thank everyone else in the administration, professors and administrators, for making this possible. You should know that there aren't many colleges that do this, and Lewis and Clark is pretty exemplary and unique in that respect. So let's hope those traits of being exemplary and unique translate into leadership for the future, and the kind of leadership that I would like to discuss this evening. I want to divide my remarks into three major categories. One, the need for us to become a humanitarian superpower. We're clearly a military superpower. That's very profitable, and it's big business. Humanitarian superpower requires tapping into a different vein of our collective senses of caring, and resolve under great pressure. I want to give just three examples of what we're losing in this world when we don't discover third world genius, other than to see them as sectarian players in wars of aggression that we have unleashed on these people, dehumanizing them. Third world genius brings to mind three examples that I've come across over the years. One was a man who many of you probably know, Muhammad Yunus, who started the microcredit movement in Bangladesh and funded mostly women in villages throughout Bangladesh by $25, $50, $100 loans for them to start their own business. That microcredit movement has been so successful it's not only spread to other countries, but it's now being seized by some of the large commercial institutions who are debasing it. Now, nobody in the IMF or World Bank thought of that idea and applied it. That was done by somebody from Bangladesh who did have experience in the United States, experience that turned him into a contrarian about conventional doctrines of economic development in underdeveloped areas. The second person was Hassan Fateh, who was an architect in Egypt, and he taught illiterate, impoverished Egyptian peasants how to build their own homes, elegant little homes from the soil underneath their feet. And that was not proposed by the World Bank or the IMF or the West. And then the third was Paulo Freire from Brazil, who developed a way of teaching peasants, illiterate peasants, how to read in just a matter of months. A format that has been copied by other educators in other parts of the world. Now, we all know about General Casey and General Petraeus, General McChrystal and General Colin Powell, and we all know about the belligerents behind them, George W. Bush, and Dick Cheney, and Barack Obama. How many of us know of the valiant struggle using peaceful means that these wonderful people, which are just a sample of what's going on in the third world, who get very little backing, get very little status, and are always fighting uphill against the forces of disintegration. The 400 richest people in the world have financial wealth equivalent to the bottom 3 billion. 3 billion. It's a highly stratified globe. By the same token, we have considerable assets from our science and technological discoveries and in the health area, whereby the UN Development Program can show how the poorest 1.2 billion people in the world who make under $1 a day can be given adequate nutrition, adequate health care, a decent amount of educational facilities, schools, and some additional necessities, bare necessities of life, to reduce the horrendous mortality and morbidity for about $100 billion a year. 100 billion. For pennies, UNICEF has shown that millions of children could be saved from fatal affliction from measles and diphtheria, malaria, bed nets. $100 billion a year is less than what we're spending blowing apart Afghanistan. I disagree with Mr. Fly on his rosy picture of the state of Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been blown apart because when you have an invader come in, sectarian revenge erupts. And we become complicit. Sometimes we foment it. There's a reason why we're shipping cargo planes full of $100 bills over to Afghanistan regularly. We have to deal with corruption, which is a way of life to survive in those countries, and we facilitate it. Because we're maneuvering in a complex, intricate society whose language we don't know, whose culture we don't know, and we're putting GIs in impossible positions. Let me turn now to the nonviolent successes in our history. I know no better way to describe these nonviolent successes than to cite the work of Coleman McCarthy, who was a Washington Post columnist, and he became an advocate of peace studies. He's actually got peace studies in the curriculum of about 500 colleges, universities, and high schools, working out of his home in Washington, D.C. And one of the points that he makes is to remind people, even though it's not a constituency for it, that peaceful nonviolence has been spectacularly successful. We often think of Mahatma Gandhi. Just think of the number of people who would have been killed in India without the leadership of the movement that he spearheaded. By example and by being activist, nonviolent, open, civil disobedience. Nelson Mandela, what turned the corner was not the armed effect of the ANC. It was his nonviolent, exemplary performance and advocacy. There were brutal regimes in the past quarter century that were overturned by people who relied on the weapons of the spirit more than on the weapons of steel, using Coleman McCarthy's language. They include the Philippines, Chile, Poland, Serbia, Georgia, Egypt, Tunisia, and of course South Africa and Macedonia. No arms really used. They haven't reached Valhalla in those countries, but they overturned their immediate dictatorships and opened up opportunities. Many of these dictators were supported by the U.S. government. By the same token, during those same years, those 25 years, American presidents and Congresses ordered up violent force in Libya, Grenada, Panama, Haiti, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. For what? Mounds of corpses, profits to weapons companies, career bonuses for generals, high rates of suicide among veterans and soldiers, and an American economy laid waste by spending on wars that can't be won, afforded, or explained. That's again from Coleman. The bias is overwhelming. 99% of money spent on dealing with conflict is military. Less than 1% is spent on ways to anticipate, prevent, or resolve conflict. We have a West Point military academy, Coleman McCarthy says, but on the east part of West Point, there is no East Point Peace Academy. The Arms Control Unit, which has been swallowed now, was a semi-independent agency, has a budget smaller than the cost of one over-cost-run F-22 fighter plane. Martin Luther King illustrated that. If anybody had a plausible rationale for armed struggle, it was black people in this country. Slavery, after the Civil War, servitude, crushing oppression, bigotry, discrimination, lynching, no opportunities for education, with few exceptions. He could have been like some people in the warmongering establishment. Look at the self-restraint. Look at the humanity. Look at the success by comparison. The trouble with peace, it doesn't connect with the visceral aggressions that are tapped into, held by some people at an extraordinary level. The macho attitude. The macho attitude now has taken over women in government. General Issa Hillary Clinton, as an example. She is now the leading harbinger, warning states of military action, having superseded Leon Panetta as Secretary of Defense. So it's not gender-based. It crosses. Minorities are vulnerable to this when they get up in high officials in government. Women are vulnerable to this. Men are certainly vulnerable to this. It's something for the mass psychologists, psychiatrists to deal with. My third category deals with the bulk of our remarks. What happens when militarism becomes the supreme option? Not the option of last resort that some of its supporters claim, but the supreme, omnipresent, trigger-ready option. What happens is it has certain consequences. We are a superpower militarily to a level unheard of. Someone once called the United States the American Sparta. There's no comparison in terms of relative asymmetry of power. We have 12 aircraft carriers. The next country is Italy. It has 2. And we're building another aircraft carrier. It'll come in at $16 billion with a B. It's big business. Militarism is often challenged by leaders who've been in real wars, who've seen the burned and tortured flesh, the screams of dying people, the incineration of men, women, and children who had no role in the conflict and just wanted to live their lives. It's the former generals who know what war is really like, not draft-dodging warmongers who grew up during the Vietnam War and loved the Vietnam War, but they didn't want to serve. They wanted their friends to go and die and kill in Vietnam while they got their draft deferments. Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Dick Cheney got 5 deferments. He was asked, he said he had more important things to do. But he wasn't a peace advocate. He wanted the war in Vietnam to continue. This is not conscientious objection. Militarism has enormous momentum. President Eisenhower saw this, and you should read his speech. January 1960, you can get it on the internet. His farewell address warning about the military-industrial complex. And read the next paragraph about its infringement on our liberties and everything sacred to us. Because he knew what war was all about. He wasn't an armchair warmonger who are now reasserting their role in pushing for war in Iran, war in Syria, war everywhere, as long as they and their adult children don't have to serve. The level of TNT equivalent was once estimated by an industrial engineering professor at Columbia University, Seymour Melman, who was right so often that he had trouble getting published, which is part of a decay sign in our society. The people who are right, who are prophetically accurate, are marginalized. The people who are wrong, the people who have blood on their hands, are the ones that are promoted either into corporate executive positions or government positions. The people who tell the truth, the people who blow the whistle ethically, they're the ones who find their lives ruined, unable to have any occupations, to have any jobs. The people who lie, who deceive, who cover up, who got our country into this illegal war in Iraq, blowing that country apart, sociocide. Where are they now? They're doing very well. Exceedingly well. They get on the TV. They get in the newspaper op-eds. Constantly. There are some constitutional law professors who would call them war criminals. Doesn't get very far. Because we have government officials who are above the law. They're above the Constitution. They're above the statutes. They're above the treaties that we signed and gave the force of federal law to, the Geneva Conventions against torture. The violation of the FISA Act, first-class felony, 5-year maximum jail term. Bush violated it, and proudly so. Cheney violated it, and so does Barack Obama. They're above the law. Here are some of the consequences of rampant militarism. One, it defines everything as self-defense. Rampant militarism is the feedstock of empire. Everything it does, no matter how remote, no matter how offensive it might be, anywhere around the globe, is justified as self-defense. So if someone speaks out against us, someone whose relatives have been killed, someone whose country has been invaded, target. Empire knows no boundaries. When it goes after an adversary, it has to exaggerate it. How else can you unleash the greatest military force in the world against a criminal gang that struck on 9/11 without exaggerating it enormously and connecting it to other exaggerations to justify the Afghanistan and Iraq war? What happens when they scatter the adversary? They go into Pakistan, they go into Yemen, they go into all kinds of other countries. So we have to go into those countries. Empire knows no boundaries. Militarism crowds out waging peace. There's no role for waging peace when the military drumbeats start. It takes over the whole psychology of the nation and corners dissidents with assertions of disloyalty. Militarism breeds expenses beyond the dreams of corporate avarice in terms of profits. The corporations have profited in trillions of dollars in the last 10 years. They have ripped off the taxpayer. They have stolen from the taxpayer. They have sold contaminated water to GIs in Iraq for money. They have overcharged on fuel. They're so criminal that the government accounting office couldn't even account, with the help of Pentagon auditors, for $9 billion of U.S. taxpayer money in the early weeks of the Iraq War. There have been some good documentaries on that. Militarism breeds excuses. For example, we can't get out of Afghanistan. It will produce a civil war. Militarism thrives on secrecy for cover-up. It thrives on abridging our Constitution, which would restrain it. Article 1, Section 8, only Congress can declare war. It thrives on abridging our civil liberties, the Patriot Act. It thrives on intimidation. Militarism militarizes foreign aid. Our foreign aid is so militarized now that it endangers our foreign aid workers, our civilian foreign aid workers in these countries. Militarism moves into the State Department. The Foreign Service feels sidelined. They're irrelevant. The giant embassy in Iraq, U.S. embassy, has all kinds of contractors and military functions. That's not the function of the State Department. It is not. Militarism distorts and wastes vast portions of our public budgets, of our government budgets. The entire cost of the Afghanistan and Iraqi war was not paid for. It is on the backs of you, the students, and your children, who are going to pay for it. Nobel Prize-winning economist Stiglitz estimates $3 trillion over the next 25 years is the total cost of the Iraq war to our country. Never mind to the Iraqis. Militarism creates contrasts that can only be called clinically insane by the institutions that foment them. I'll give you an example. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, is tasked with dealing with 58,000 American workers who lose their lives due to workplace-related disease and trauma. That's not counting the injured and the sick. That's a 9/11 casualty equivalent in less than a month, every month, year after year. Its budget's $550 million. The Peace Corps, which is our good step abroad, its budget is $375 million a year, the entire budget. What do you think the budget is with the private contractors and the government expenses to protect the gigantic embassy in Baghdad and its personnel last year? $675 million. That's clinical insanity. You shouldn't even be there in the first place with that kind of apparatus. Much less, what kind of respect do we have for the lives of workers in this country? What kind of respect do we have for human life in this country? Militarism propels the development of new technologies that allow for more remote-controlled warfare, which facilitates even more militarism and more aggression overseas of our unconstitutional wars. Drones can wipe out all kinds of people. So sorry, collateral damage. 12 little boys collecting firewood in a hillside in Afghanistan last year. Evaporated. Sorry. Collateral damage. They're pushing buttons in Virginia and Nevada. 9-to-5 job controlling the drones. That's why a lot of international law experts, apart from violating national sovereignty in airspace, believe that drones operating that way should be declared illegal under international law. The head of national intelligence for Barack Obama, now retired, Dennis Blair, stated that drones are producing far more harm than good for American security and foreign policy. Another consequence is on the international rule of law. You know, we drafted a lot of these international treaties. We drafted the architecture for Nuremberg trials. We drafted a lot of the Geneva Conventions. We were the main drafters of the UN Charter. Consider that Mr. Fly never mentioned the legal authority for our interventionism. He just said it's a fact. We'll get to that later. Blowback is everywhere. It's a CIA word. The reason why it's a CIA word is because it's occurred so often. Blowback against our own interests of foreign adventures. Who built up the Mujahideen, who are in their latest transformation, the Taliban? Who was the ally of the anti-communist Saddam Hussein and gave licenses to U.S. companies to provide him against the Iranians, whose country he invaded with our intelligence and logistical support, licenses that provided him with the materials for chemical warfare? Documented. Senate Banking Committee report, among many other documentations, under Ronald Reagan. Blowback is everywhere. Because the nature of empire is invariably devours its own. It so impoverishes its own people. Budgets are being cut, education budgets, Repair America budgets. Everywhere the necessities of public life are being cut, so we can spend trillions of dollars over a period of years in wars of aggression against nations that never threatened us. You're attacked by a criminal gang, you go after the criminal gang, you don't blow apart a country. You don't then invade another country that never threatened us. One of the blowbacks is the main crop of Afghanistan is now heroin, poppies. It's a leading narco state in the world. And before we invaded Afghanistan, we actually called the Taliban over and we gave them a $40 million reward for stamping out the poppy trade. That's another blowback. The blowback on our veterans is cruel. It's insupportable. We flatter them going out. We bring them back. We muster them out with the trumpets, and then they're on their own. They have higher unemployment rates and higher homeless rates than the average population. And the post-traumatic syndrome shows that their conscience was troubled. It wasn't just a physical trauma. Their conscience was troubled because of what they were asked to do, to kill and die for a cause they couldn't possibly justify. And the only professional poll ever done on U.S. soldiers in the field in Iraq in 2005 January resulted in over 70% of the soldiers, including over 50% of the Marines, saying that we should get out of there between 6 and 12 months. For logistic reasons, they said 6 to 12 months. Those are the soldiers. Anybody who's been in the military knows that the soldiers are there to protect themselves and their buddies first and foremost. That's what they're there for. They're flattered into thinking they're there for noble reasons. That soldier who wrote the letter that was just cited, he might have saved a child, he might grow up and save the world. How about all the children who were slaughtered? Who might have grown up to save the world? I think they outnumber themselves. Quite often, to see the remoteness, the banality of cruel militarism. 70% of the American people want to get out of Afghanistan. Even with the propaganda of Bush and Cheney, unrebutted by the complicit Democrats, the ink blot Congress, and the supine media in 2003, 2004, half of the people in this country didn't think it was a good idea. Imagine if we had a real two-party system. the people who tell the truth are punished. The people who release materials relating to crimes, official crimes, are in solitary confinement, or they're sought after under the Espionage Act, where the penalty is death. There's no penalty for covering up the facts that could have undermined the Bush-Cheney cause to invade Iraq, is there? There's no penalty there. Militarism breeds propaganda. It breeds mind control. It breeds the antithesis of critical thinking and dissent. Above all, militarism destroys our checks and balances. It turns Congress, with its own complicity, into an assigner of its constitutional duties to the executive branch, to concentrate more and more power in the White House. Worse than ever. And it also impairs so seriously our constitutional practice. I might also say that it redefines the priorities of preventing violence by focusing on terrorist attacks, properly so, but undermining hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in this country domestically: air pollution, hospital infection, medical malpractice, not having health insurance. All this very documented, that we spend virtually no political attention on, no budget on, nothing. It's a disgrace. It's almost as if you want to save all these lives in America, you wish that their death could be attributed to some foreign terrorist gang, so the White House would pay attention to Americans here at home. Preventable violence. Lastly, it shreds our freedoms. The violence that peace advocates oppose goes well beyond military violence. It includes the extension of all kinds of violence: domestic violence, environmental violence, racial violence, economic violence, sexual violence, legal and illegal violence, homophobic violence, corporate violence, street violence, police violence. It becomes a violent culture. It becomes a violent culture. Jonathan Turley, the law professor at George Washington University, put in the the Washington Post, this is a little bit before 5 retired generals said, "Do not invade Iran." He gave the reasons in the Washington Post. But he put a document, which I have copies for those of you who want it, a document where he says, 10 reasons we're no longer the land of the free after 9/11. You see, militarism exacts a serious price in domestic freedom. And he says, 1, assassination of U.S. citizens. That's the Obama doctrine, you know, prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner, and cover-up. Big job description in the White House. Indefinite detention without charges. Arbitrary justice in terms of whether you're going to get a military tribunal or civilian court. Warrantless searches, you know, snooping without a warrant. Secret evidence. Secret courts. Immunity from judicial review for government employees who might have been prosecuted. War crimes, same thing. Extraordinary rendition, still going on. Continually monitoring of citizens, using GPS devices and pretty soon domestic drones, and immunity from judicial review. How do you like that? So when you see a soldier coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and you hear somebody say, "Thank you for your service. Thank you for defending our freedoms." If you overhear that, you may come up, tap the 2 on your shoulder and say, "You want to defend our freedoms, soldiers? You better be redeployed to Washington, D.C." People cite their parents. I'll cite my father, who years ago said, "If you want to further democracy abroad, it's a pretty good idea to have a democracy here at home."
challenging comments. I'm Paula Abrams, and I am the moderator tonight, and I get the pleasure of introducing myself, which means I will be very brief. I teach constitutional law at the law school, and I'm very pleased to be here and be a part of this significant debate here. What I'd like to do for the remainder of the time we have, I'd like to pose a question to each of our speakers. And then I would like to ask each of them to pose a question to each other. At that point, we will open it up to the floor for questions from the audience. I'd like to pick up, I think, from the comments of Mr. Nader. War is supposed to be painful. And it seems to me that our system of government, our constitutional system, contains disincentives to war. Most significantly, the lodging of declaring war, lodging that power in Congress. And secondly, the concept of the citizen soldier, that we feel in our families, our lives, our loved ones, our communities, the impact of war. And it seems to me that that system has shifted without too much public debate. And so the question I pose is really one going forward, one of the question of accountability and checks. And Mr. Nader alluded to the question of drones and drone technology as distancing warfare from humanity and the human consequences in this country. So Mr. Ply perhaps would like to respond to that, but I'd like to ask each of the speakers to respond to the question of privatization of the military and the impact that that has on incentives to pursue war and military intervention. We've seen two very different perspectives here on the value and the legitimacy of military intervention. And increasingly, as we turn decisions over to military personnel who are private contractors and private consultants who are working for profit, that is another factor that distances the consequences of war from our citizenry. So I'd like to perhaps Mr. Ply start.
Sure. I certainly have a lot of disagreements with Mr. Nader. He went through a long laundry list of things. I'm tempted to respond to all kinds of things, but I think on some of these issues I actually share some of his concerns. And when we get to the drone issue in a minute, I actually share some of his concerns there. But on the general issue of accountability, and Mr. Nader hinted at it in terms of the War Powers Act and Congress not exercising its appropriate role in terms of declaring war and the executive perhaps running roughshod over our legislature. This is a constant refrain we always deal with. It's something that has been, again, a long-running debate between the branches of government. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. President Obama, I think, taught constitutional law at one point and had a particular view, at least in the case of the intervention in Libya, that what he was doing was perfectly legal. What I would often say, and I did during the debate about Libya, and there were a lot of, quite frankly, probably more Republicans who were against the intervention in Libya than there were Democrats, if I recall correctly. What I told my Republican and conservative friends on Capitol Hill, they hold the power of the purse, and if they want to defund any effort, they can, but they were not willing to do that, or not enough of them were willing to do that. So I think even whatever your views are about whether the War Powers Act is constitutional and whether the executive branch should in every case go to Congress and ask them to declare war, or whether there are certain instances where for a specific amount of time that the executive branch has that authority. I think in the end, we still do have checks in place, and we do have accountability. I mean, I understand the concern about militarism and a variety of problems that our country faces, but anyone who spends any time in Washington on Capitol Hill, this is not in just a rubber stamp environment on all these issues. There are committees holding hearings and doing investigations into a lot of the types of abuse that Mr. Nader was talking about, questions about the covert side of the war on terror, and questions like rendition and things like that. These are issues that are constantly being debated. So I do find it somewhat, I think, ridiculous to argue that somehow we are no longer living in democracy, because that's just not the case. We do have a robust debate about these issues. It just so happens that we have an administration right now that actually has continued and expanded some of these provisions from its predecessor, which I think has upset a lot of people, but that was they were not expecting this administration to pursue similar policies. A lot of that goes back, though, to how you view the threat environment. And I'm not sure what Mr. Nader's view is, but if you do not feel the United States of America is under a threat of attack from anyone, any entity, any state, then sure, we can get rid of all these variety of tools that we use around the world. But clearly that's not what successive commanders-in-chief, when they get into positions of power, when they have access to sensitive information and intelligence, they see the threat picture, they see people plotting on a regular basis to carry out attacks on American soil. They understand what the American people's tolerance would be for such attacks. And they come up with policies that they feel are in the best interest of this country in protecting the American people and keeping Americans safe. Now, maybe from time to time they choose policies that are not the best, but that's, again, why we have our system and we have Congress that's supposed to play its role in holding them accountable. Quickly on drones, I will just say that part of what I was getting at earlier in terms of having a U.S. whole-of-government approach that can deal with some of the fundamental problems in some of these foreign countries is aimed at getting to the point where we don't need to pursue strategies, which I would agree with Mr. Nader. In Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, these are not strategies that are in the long run in American interest. These are short-term strategies trying to go after a very narrow, specific, in-the-moment problem of individual terrorist leaders and others who are literally plotting attacks on American soil that will be carried out in the coming weeks and months. This is not, in the long run, creating a more stable Yemen or a more stable Pakistan or a more stable Somalia. And I think there are many problems with that approach. And I think that's an issue that, unfortunately, our leaders, because we have been focused on other areas, have been very tempted to go with some of these new technological means to try to kick these problems down the road. But that's not sustainable, and that's why we need an appropriate foreign assistance budget. That's why we need a broader strategy in a country like Yemen or Somalia. These failed states will continue to pose threats to the United States, and the fascination with drones, I think, is not entirely warranted. And so I would agree with him on that. On the privatization of the U.S. military, I think that clearly the United States government in general, not just on the military front, has probably relied on private contractors too much in the last decade. I think this is a bipartisan area of concern where a number of members of Congress have been trying to highlight some of the problems with that approach. I always found it troubling when I was in the Department of Defense and I would be in a policy meeting and there would be representatives of a private sector company who were staffing their office. I just thought that it did not make sense for private companies to be sitting on policy meetings. And so I think that's something that we also need to dial back. But the notion that this is part of some broader military-industrial complex, that this is some sort of coherent effort to try to take over the U.S. government, as it's sometimes portrayed, is just not accurate. And I think anyone who's worked inside the U.S. government realizes that the U.S. government as an entity is not that capable of an institution where it could even achieve such a thing if it wanted to.
So you might not have a disagreement on drones and privatization?
They're not trying to take over the U.S. government. They are the U.S. government. That's what a corporate state is. That's what Eisenhower warned about when he said military-industrial complex. They go back and forth, trade jobs between Lockheed Martin, high official jobs in the Pentagon. The corporatization, I prefer the word corporatization, of governmental functions in the military area has led, first of all, to a lot of waste and corruption. Staggering waste and corruption. We would stumble on this with people who are contractors with the U.S. government. On Southwest Airlines once, we met a contractor who provides dogs for the U.S. Army to sniff out mines. And the contract for 1 year for a dog handler and a dog with an insurance policy and a guarantee that if the dog is harmed, there'll be a replacement dog. It's $500,000 a year. Cooks that get paid $40,000 are part of contracts that are as high as $120,000 for the markup. I mean, these are some of the more modest. So one is waste and corruption, a lot of corruption. You look at the Pentagon audits, they're overwhelmed. They can't even begin to keep up. Hundreds of millions here, hundreds of millions there. They just can't keep up. And they certainly don't get enough support from OSD, the Office of Secretary of Defense. The other consequence is, and you see this in these military government seminars and conferences in Washington and trade shows, national security trade shows, is they're always looking for a new enemy. I mean, how do you keep 800 billion? I mean, that's a beast that needs to be fed. And so now you see how Obama he said he's moving his attention to the Pacific. China. So if they want to sell more sophisticated equipment, what better thing to do than to see this rising military giant that doesn't even have one completed aircraft carrier yet, rising in the east, the South China Sea. We're sending 2,500 Marines to Darwin in Australia, not for training exercises, signaling to China. China may signal back, expand more its military. It may provoke Japan. Japan in the last few weeks has been very upset. And so we get another arms race. And here we go again. We have to break this Gordian knot. And when you corporatize government functions, where now the Army doesn't even feed itself, it's fed by contractors. And surveillance, and look at Blackwater and Iraq, and so on. Military functions. What you do is you build another layer of powerful commercial interests behind this constant military expansionism. And it's really, I would have thought more from a graduate of American University, Jamie. But when you start using this old saw, and I bet to myself you would use it because you associate with people like William Crystal. William Crystal's ball was never-ending war against Islamic countries. When you said, look at it, it's the lowest percent of the GDP since World War II. That's not the measure. In other words, if you buy 6 cars, does that justify a higher percent of military expenditure? The measure is it's half of the U.S. government's operating expenditures. That doesn't count Medicare and Medicaid, which are insurance. Half. We have no major enemy left. And we're spending tens of billions of dollars keeping our soldiers in Western Europe and Eastern Asia defending prosperous countries like Japan, South Korea with a superior military by far to North Korea. We're defending Germany, Italy, France, England. Against who? Who's the enemy? Moldova? Inner Mongolia? That happens to be almost $80 billion this year. That would give every student in America going to a public university free tuition and have some money left over, including the soldiers coming back. The other thing corporatization does is it develops another veneer to put our country into a pattern of violation of international law. Now, I can tell you that we are one of the few countries left in the world that hasn't signed the landmines treaty. 158 countries have signed the landmines treaty, severely restricting production, if not prohibiting production and deployment of landmines, because the main victims are civilians and children. We haven't signed it. We have no intention so far of signing it, even though it's received letters of support from 68 senators, 16 Nobel Prize laureates, Peace Prize laureates, key NATO allies, retired senior military personnel, etc., etc. We are also in the minority of signing the new cluster bomb treaty. 107 states have signed it, and it went into adoption in May 2008. Now, when you get the corporations inside the military, when they have one lobbyist for every member of Congress, these military companies, and are offering jobs to Pentagon brats when they retire. You have a further vested interest in becoming the malicious exception from the rule of law. If there's any country in the world that should lead with the rule of law, it should be the most powerful country in the world. It should be the military superpower. It should be the country that has the most to lose by the destruction of the international rule of law and constitutionalism. And we keep provoking it, and don't think we're not banking revenge in those countries that will come back to haunt us. It will come back to haunt us, and it will just feed the military beast even more. Blow back again. Blow back again. As far as Congress is concerned, is this the Congress I know, Jamie? I mean, listen to this. You have military budgets annually for Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't go through the usual appropriation process. They go special appropriations, 50 billion here, 50 billion there. Pretty soon, as Effort Dirksen said, it adds up to real money. Okay? The second thing that's very important about Congress is they're trying to get out of Article 1, Section 8. We haven't declared war since World War II, and we've been in a lot of wars. And war resolutions just don't cut it. And now, they're not even requested. The Libyan War, the war on Libya, occurred without a war resolution, without an authorization of money, without an appropriation of money, without a declaration of war. No president in history has stretched the distance from the constitutional power of the U.S. Congress more than Barack Obama in the war on Libya. Now you might say, oh, he's a terrible dictator. So, do you know what's happening in Libya now? It's splitting. It's wars between the militias. This is what happens when we go into a culture and a country and invade and take sides when there are tribal forces on all sides of the equation. Very easy to get sectarian revenge and bloodshed that way. The rule of law is one way to require more deliberation by Congress and to honor the framers who assiduously did not want to put the war-making power in the executive branch. And they put it in Congress for reasons, public deliberation. And that's now, in effect, de facto repeal. Just nobody invokes it. Nobody stands up on the floor anymore to invoke it. Congress is, as Bruce Vine described it, an ink blot when it comes to foreign and military affairs. There are no Fulbright-type hearings examining the Vietnam War under John Kerry, examining the Afghanistan War. John Kerry's become an emissary of the State Department. There's no debate on the floor of the House and Senate, the way we used to debate these things years ago. It's an ink blot. It has repealed its oath of office to obey its constitutional requirements. Very, very serious.
Jamie, I'll take that as a question to you. What about the role of Congress here?
No, I think the issue in the end is if the American people are, well, number one, if the facts are such that Congress is not playing the role the American people want them to on these issues, they have an opportunity to go to the polls and make a choice that can bring new leadership into Congress. But the fact of the matter is that obviously, I'd actually like to see foreign policy be more of an issue of debate in American politics and American elections, but the American people aren't concerned enough about these issues or don't have the viewpoint that Mr. Nader is advocating and that level of concern about Congress's role. I'm not denying that there's waste and corruption in the Defense Department or the military budget. There's waste and corruption in everything government does. Every single government agency has waste and corruption and inefficiencies. We should go after those budgets and those problems as much as possible and eliminate them. You can rattle off all kinds of horrible stories, but the bottom line, I think, is it all goes back to what sort of role we want our country to play in the world. And I guess my question for Mr. Nader. I'm getting, from his line of argument, I'm basically getting the sense that he doesn't believe we should play much of a role in the world, because if you talk about wanting to pursue the weapons of the spirit rather than weapons of steel, I mean, I think I'm all for that. I'm all for supporting people who are seeking democracy and human rights in their own countries, not necessarily doing so with military means. I think President Obama could be doing a lot more to provide moral leadership on some of these issues. We need to remember that a lot of people who are trying to take these matters into their own hands, they often want assistance. The Libyan people were asking for our assistance. The Syrian people are now asking for our assistance. The Bosnian people were asking for our assistance in the 1990s. People, when they took to the streets in June 2009 in Iran, trying to overthrow their government, were holding up signs saying, Obama, where are you? America is looked to provide some sort of leadership in the world. And again, I go back to my previous remarks. If we decide that we're tired, we're sick of this, we don't have the money, we've got too many problems at home, we don't want to lead anymore, that's one thing. But we need to be honest about what the debate is that we're actually having. And I think that those who don't think we should be doing these things in the world need to say that outright, that we don't want to play this role in the world anymore, because it will be a significant change in the direction of American foreign policy. It will be going back on decades of American foreign policy. And I would just generally argue, given that we don't see the American people energized about these issues, I don't think they want such a significant change. So I'd like to ask Mr. Nader, basically, what role should we play in the world? Do we face any threats? And can America ever be a force for good in the broader world?
Role is a humanitarian superpower, and the only use of military force is for authentic, not contrived self-defense. That's the only justification of the UN Charter. It's the only justification of our framers' plan, and that should be the only justification. Empires define self-defense as killing people in remote lands who we think don't like us and are urging resistance to our invasions of countries that didn't threaten us. So, there's a lot of dirty works going on here as we speak. Doors are being broken down, families are being uprooted in the middle of the night. They're called special forces raids. They're assassination raids. The people said the other day, at least Obama doesn't torture people like Bush. No, he kills them instead. That's one way to prevent it. So, self-defense, and the greatest role for our country is to extend our life-saving science, appropriate technology, holding out our hand for agricultural co-ops, for cleaning drinking water, which takes a couple million children's lives, contaminated drinking water, dealing with tuberculosis, AIDS, dealing with diphtheria, dealing with malaria. 1 million children die in malaria in Africa every year, or not. We're just beginning to send out malarial nets. Still, the majority of people don't even have them. They cost about $10, $15 each, mass produced. So at least at night, when the mosquitoes come out, at dusk, people can be protected. Why aren't we excited by all these things? Why is it? Because we have a culture of violence. We have a culture of peace. Peace is powerful. Don't any of us adhere to the great religions who espouse peace? What do they call Jesus Christ? The Prince of Peace. And in his name, and in the name of other founders, they justify wars. The other thing is this, is that militarism sequesters a lot of information. Now, Mr. Fly and his group have written articles, basically, regime change in Iran. And let's pour military assistance, if not more, into regime change in Syria. Do they realize what the consequences of that are for innocent people? Do they realize what the consequences are for the Christians and the Alawites if there is a Sunni-produced bloodbath after having been repressed by Assad, the Alawite? You see, we wouldn't throw up our hands and say, look at these people, they're killing each other. They don't know how to live together. If we're willing to destabilize, then we have to adhere to the rule of international law. That if you invade a country, you are required under international law to protect the civilian population. Did we protect the Iraqi civilian population? Because of our invasion and the consequences, over 1 million Iraqis have died, 5 million displaced and refugees, the economy blown apart, to give a rosy story of Iraq, is heading toward another dictatorship under Maliki. He's beginning to attack the Sunnis again. The Sunnis are terrorizing the Shiites, 50 dead here, 100 dead there. The Kurds are about to split off. And the drinking water is contaminated. The health care has been devastated. The doctors have been killed or expelled. I mean, who are we talking about here? And we say, oh, I'm sorry, that's it. But then the argument is, well, that's why we can't pull out of Afghanistan. Create a civil war. See, it's limitless. We don't think through here what we're heading for. That's why the U.S. Army, up to the 4-star general, opposed the Iraqi invasion. Because they knew what they were getting into. And there was no backup plan, and there was no planning. The Navy and Air Force, they didn't they push buttons. It's the soldiers, the Army that knows what they're getting into. They were muscled. There were all kinds. I counted up to 300. Before March 2003, retired military, high officials, the diplomatic corps retired national security, one of them spoke here, Anthony Zinni. They opposed the invasion of Iraq, and even they didn't get pressed. I often said if George Soros developed an infrastructure, he was opposed to the invasion of Iraq, and he wrote a book on it, we wouldn't have invaded Iraq. Because they would have had infrastructure, they would have national media, they would have gone up on Capitol Hill, and the lives of Bush and Cheney, now documented by their own people. Look at the chagrin of Colin Powell, how he was misled to give it the best side of Colin Powell's story in his testimony for the United Nations, saying there was chemical biological warfare activity in Iraq. He was lying to them by the security news, and he said it afterwards. It was the worst thing that ever happened to him in his entire career. This is what happens when you have this kind of abandonment of deliberate due process, probable cause, constitutionalism. There are reasons for the rule of law. And David Stockman, the other day, he's the very conservative budget director for Ronald Reagan. Someone asked him, what do you do about gas prices? They're over $4, heading to $5. He said, stop the war talk against Iran. Because the speculators in the New York Mercantile Exchange thrive on those kinds of rumors to raise your gas prices and your heating oil prices. And every penny that goes up for a year is $1.8 billion more out of your pockets. So because we don't have all sides discussed, you have no idea of the prominent opposition to attacking Iraq and Israel. The former head of Mossad said it was one of the craziest ideas he's ever heard. The leading military historian, Martin Van Kriebo, says, we can handle Iran. You handled the Soviet Union. You handled China. He wasn't worried. There's a lot of dissent going on. 5 generals had a full-page ad. You don't hear that. You don't hear that operating. You hear these warmongering forces connected with business. It's very, 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 very irresistible situation in Washington. You get rewarded, you get honored, you get status by strategies of war. Strategies of peace, you're 99 pound weakling. Strategies of peace is something considered weak until you've been involved in the bloody mess of war. And let's not exaggerate what happens in war. General George Patton, you couldn't have a tougher World War II general. He was once asked, General Patton, what is your definition of battlefield courage? He said, fear plus 5 minutes. The most difficult courage is the moral courage to stand up to power, because the retaliatory response is so vicious over time. You lose your job, you get marginalized, slandered, etc.
Let's try and take a few questions. There's lights. We can ask people to line up. We're only going to have time for a few, and I'll ask you to keep your questions short, and I'll ask the speakers to try and keep their answers short, too, so we can have time for a few. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Is this on? Yes. Mr. Fly, I would like you, if you could, tell me what was accomplished by the 10 years of major U.S. intervention in Vietnam, besides killing 2 million Vietnamese, defoliating large areas of the country, poisoning the water supply, creating millions of refugees, burning hundreds of villages, leveling dozens of North Vietnamese cities to the ground, killing 58,000 Americans, injuring 300,000 Americans, and spending over $1 trillion in today's dollars.
I didn't quite expect to get into a debate about the Vietnam War, given the topic tonight. I'm not up here saying that every single decision that the United States government has ever made about engaging in military conflict was 100% accurate, that there were no mistakes made. I was actually not even alive during the Vietnam War, so I was not part of those debates. I was very active and was certainly studying and following these issues during the debate about Iraq. And I understand that there are always multiple sides of people who have different views on these sorts of issues. I think if you look at where Vietnam is today, I mean, it's actually a burgeoning economy. It's getting increasingly closer to the United States as China rises. And I don't see how Vietnam has been fundamentally set back by the Vietnam War.
Vietnam is successful today because we left.
The question we're facing with all of these issues, and Mr. Nader was talking about Iraq at length, Iraq is better off as well. I challenge you to talk to Iraqis who lived under the repressive, brutal regime of Saddam Hussein and tell them that somehow their life is worse off today than it was under the rule of Saddam Hussein. I mean, if we want to have the view that American power can never be used as a force for good, then we might as well just stay at home and try to establish fences and walls and hope that no one in the world ever comes after us, but that's not realistic. These are tough decisions that our leaders have to make, and as I mentioned before, we've seen this is not just one administration or the other who are engaged in these sorts of very tough action. They are looking at a threat picture and they are trying to do what's best for the American people. And yes, they err from time to time, but I think in general they get it right.
Thank you. This is why I have a real question for you. Specifically about China. You mentioned a couple of times China, the rise of China. They're going to be close to our GDP spending in 25 years. And it's a typical view I hear that I'm worried about as a negative thing. To me, it seems that we're really worried about global security and these issues. We could gain a lot of efficiency by deferring to regional rising powers like China and India. So I was just wondering what your take is on the prospects for foreign policy in regards to deferring to regional powers.
And your question was for?
Mr. Fry, sorry. Why? Sorry.
The rise of China, I think it's something we need to be concerned about. It will not necessarily mean that the United States ever gets into an actual conflict with China. I think part of what Mr. Nader was mocking in terms of the presence of Marines in Australia and some of our administration's so-called pivot to Asia, though, gets at the heart of the issue. Again, if we don't care what China becomes, if we don't care what China does to its neighbors, both economically and militarily, then fine, let's forget about it. Let's not even focus on Asia. But I can tell you for sure that our traditional allies in Japan, South Korea, Australia are new and emerging allies. Countries like India, countries like Vietnam are very concerned about what the rise of China means for their security, and they're looking to the United States for leadership. And that's why they think the administration has been right to pay more attention to Asia. The question is, are we a Pacific power? Do we care about what happens in the Pacific? The energy markets that Mr. Nader is so concerned about when it comes to Iran, just general commerce, global commerce in general, rely on the U.S. Navy to actually maintain open seas, to maintain that some of these strategic choke points around the world are not blocked by either pirates or by terrorist attacks or by other regions. The goods that you get on a daily basis, many of them come from China only because of the role that our U.S. Navy plays. The Chinese are not going to be looking out for our economic interests as they rise. They're not going to be carrying out those same roles. And so I think that's the sort of issue we're facing. If we are showing the Chinese that we're going to remain a Pacific power, they'll develop in a particular way. It will not necessarily lead to this confrontation after confrontation that Mr. Nader has been describing.
You should worry about what would the urging of our U.S. multinational corporations that have abandoned this country has encouraged China to do to our economy here before you go into South Asia. In terms of job loss, contaminated products, and shipping jobs abroad to China, which is, after all, an authoritarian regime that abuses its workers enormously. Workers that are run by companies in contract with companies like Apple and Walmart. Actually, you should pay a little attention. I mean, worry a little bit about the situation here at home, Jamie, before you worry about Sri Lanka and their concern with China. I mean, I don't understand the lack of concern for what's happening to millions of people in this country. Workers, patients, the preventable deaths. That's what empire does. It reallocates resources abroad. And you don't have any room for talking about these trade-offs. And you don't have any room for talking about the rule of law. Have you ever heard Bill Kristol say, no, that adventure overseas would be unlawful? You show me Bill Kristol saying that on TV, and I'll show you a visiting Martian. It's just a remarkable lack of just factual awareness of how our society, country, economy, environment are in decay. Our long-held institutions are being starved. They're about to close 3,500 postal branches, the post office, in rural areas where there are people, many of them elderly, who get their medicines there, who don't have transportation to go 10, 15 miles down the road. The Postmaster General says it'll save $200 million in the budget out of $70 billion. Well, what is it going to cost these people to have to make these very difficult adjustments in rural areas throughout the country? Now, here's the comparison. Do you know what $200 million is? It's less than one day's U.S. military expenditure in Afghanistan. They're shutting down these 3,500 post offices, and that's just the beginning. We're strip mining our country for our empire.
My mind is small rejoinder. We're strip mining our country for our entitlement system, not for our empire.
I'm an internationalist. I'm an internationalist by persuasion, and so I would tend to agree with you. If we were really defending democracy, when you look at the U.S. intervention, South Vietnam, El Salvador, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, these are brutal dictatorships. Iraq, if you look at Freedom House, it's ranked as not free. If you look at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, we're talking about torture on a systematic basis, death squads, murders of dissidents, shutting down Transparency International ranks Baghdad as the third most corrupt government in the world, surpassed only by Somalia and Afghanistan. Again, the human rights situation in Afghanistan under Karzai is similarly horrific. How can you say we're defending democracies when the vast majority of the countries for which we have intervened, the vast majority of the countries that receive U.S. military aid, the vast majority of countries where we train their troops are brutal dictatorships?
I think it's certainly a major issue that we can do a lot more on. I've actually just signed a letter yesterday of a number of human rights organizations expressing concern about the situation in Bahrain, where we have a major naval base, and they've been cracking down over the last year. Certainly my work and my organizations is constantly highlighting the work that the U.S. government should be doing in countries like Saudi Arabia and others in the Middle East, who are, because of strategic concerns, our allies, but who certainly need to pursue democratic reforms. So I'm completely with you. This is not like flipping a light switch. You cannot suddenly either militarily intervene or even diplomatically and convince a country to just completely change their systems. It's a process. And the question is, Iraq is at least on a path. The problem is that
more people have died in the past 9 years, more civilians have died in the past 9 years since the U.S. invasion in the previous 9 years of Saddam Hussein. Far more civilians. Polls show a majority of Iraqis, as horrific as Saddam Hussein was, actually thought it was better under Saddam Hussein than since the U.S. invasion.
I would just dispute that. I think the Iraqis actually have a future now, which they did not under Saddam Hussein. And again, it doesn't. I'm not saying everything we've done has been perfect. I have a lot of concerns about how the invasion of Iraq went about and how the post-conflict situation was handled or not handled adequately. The U.S. government has made a lot of mistakes, but I don't think that that simply means that the whole enterprise was doomed from the start.
Mr. Fry, you are the protege of well-known figures in the neocon group who told us that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were going to be quick and successful and cheap. 10 years later, I ask you what you foresee in Iran if we should attack the nuclear installations. It seems like everyone agrees that it would only set back Iran should it choose to make a nuclear weapon by a year or two, and certainly solidify their intent to defend themselves by getting a weapon. Under those circumstances, the only kind of military action against Iran that makes sense is to occupy them. I want you to tell us what it's going to be like.
I do not support an invasion of Iran, and have never written or said such a thing. The question is, do we care if Iran gets nuclear weapons? Mr. Nader was making the point, basically, I think that we can deal with it. That's certainly a valid viewpoint. I don't share that viewpoint. The general consensus in Washington is not there. President Obama does not believe that Iran with nuclear weapons is acceptable. Most of our European allies do not believe it's acceptable. Our allies in the Gulf and in the region do not believe it's acceptable. So then the question is, if you are not willing to accept the nuclear Iran, and you're concerned about the implications of that, what are you willing to do to prevent it? For far too long, we haven't been willing to enact sanctions as quickly as we could have, and so that has left us at the current situation where the Iranians are essentially on the cusp of getting nuclear weapons, and we're presented with a menu of very bad options. The gentleman is right that any limited military strike by the U.S. or Israel will only set the program back by several years. In the end, that may be what President Obama does. I don't think he'll do it this year, but maybe if he's reelected. But that's not going to solve the problem. The article that Mr. Nader was referencing, I was making the point that a limited military strike is not going to work in the long run. The real problem we have is with the revolutionary regime in Tehran that represses its people, that's one of the worst human rights offenders in the world. And as long as that regime is in power, it's going to continue to threaten our interests and the interests of our allies. And so the broader issue is the regime. Now, my hope is that the Iranian people will rise up once again like they did in June 2009, hopefully this time with more support from the United States and others, instead of sitting on our hands and actually at least speaking out and saying, we're with you. We're with people who actually are taking the streets for their freedom and getting shot and killed, rather than just remaining silent, because we want to deal with the horrible regime that's cracking down and murdering them. So that's my best case scenario for the end of the Iranian nuclear issue. I hope it is the Iranians wielding the weapons of the spirit that Mr. Nader referenced. I don't know if that'll be the case, but unfortunately, I don't know that Israel will wait, or even that the United States will be willing to wait that long, and then you get into a series of discussions about what type of military action, and it's not going to be pretty, I can tell you that. But the bottom line is, this is a regime that threatens our interests, and that I think should not be allowed to possess nuclear weapons. And again, I think I'm basically in agreement with the current administration on that fact.
It's interesting, isn't it? Interesting. Can I respond?
Sure, and then we're going to wrap up. We'll finish on Iran with this.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that Curtis LeMay wanted to bomb the Soviet Union before it got nuclear weapons, and even after. Luckily, he was restrained. He was head of the Air Force Strategic Command. When Mao Zedong said, after they launched their first nuclear weapons, testing in 1964, well, a nuclear war will only lose 300 million people. You know, people could be permitted to think Mao had a bad day when he said that. We didn't attack. Now, Iran has never invaded anybody in 250 years. They're no different from any other regime. They want to survive. There are 100 to 200 advanced nuclear weapons in Israel that could obliterate Iraq in a matter of minutes. They want to survive. They've been very, very reasonable in terms of their own survival. They offered a very sophisticated peace plan in the early 2000s and was rejected by Washington. They wanted to have all kinds of negotiations. They're scared. Never mind what you think about their politics and their repression. They're scared. We invaded them with our proxy Saddam Hussein, 300,000 or 400,000 dead. We got them surrounded in the west and the east, to the south, with U.S. Army, Air Force, and Navy. We shot down one of their civilian airliners. We overthrew their elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh, in 1953, installing the dictatorial, brutal Shah for 27 years. Do you think they forget that? They were called the Axis of Evil by George W. Bush, along with North Korea and Iraq. We invaded Iraq. I wonder if they were afraid that we were going to invade Iran. How foolish could they be? Look at it from the other side. The key here is these Israelis know that 1 or 2 or 3 nuclear weapons, and they can't possibly move that quickly. Mossad and the CIA said that the Iranians have not made the move toward nuclear weapons. And the question is whether we're going to even prevent them from having the capability. Well, you got 60 countries that have the capability. Brazil has the capability. Argentina has the capability. How far are we going to go here? But the Israelis, you know, they have this facade. They come over here and they fool us. Because after all, you know, who do you think has more influence on Israeli, Palestinian, Middle East issues in Congress? Do you think it's the President of the United States or the Israeli lobby? But in Israel, they know it's a crock of ridiculous. It's not going to threaten them. They know how to deal with it. They've already sabotaged the Iranians with our help. We blew up a missile base. We're killing Iranian nuclear scientists. We got special forces in Iran on the QT, in and out. We have to create another enemy. We have to keep the machine going. We have to distract attention from our own domestic necessities. We have to avoid redefining national security, which means preventing life and limb and disease in all possible ways, whether they are in Toledo, Ohio, or whether they are in the headquarters of the World Trade Center. We have to redefine national security to include domestic national security. All I ask you to do is read the dissent in Israel on Iran. Read the dissent in the newspapers. Read the dissent in some of the parties. You won't find it in the U.S. Congress. You won't find it in the Washington Post. To what extent are we going to be fooled and entrapped in another war that's going to blow a hole and create a recession in this country, skyrocket energy prices, and unleash the retaliation by the Iranians from the borders of India to Lebanon? The head of national security for Iran sent a message to General Petraeus a while back. He said, if you want to know anything about your national security, from the borders of India to Lebanon, check in with me. This is not Iraq. This is not Syria. This is a country that's been preparing to be attacked for many years. And do we need another war, another collapse of the stock market, another shredding of our pensions? This is insanity. There's no other word for it. We don't have time to deduce the evidence here. But we need a national discussion all over the country like we've had tonight. All over the country. Get rid of our iPhones for a few hours. Stop the text messages. Look at ourselves in the mirror and look at what we're going to say to our descendants here. We've so trivialized the promise of this country, here and abroad, that we should be ashamed of ourselves. And we should look in the mirror and ask, how much time do we spend on our civic and political responsibilities, in addition to going out to vote? How much time are we spending? We have micro-dictatorships over parts of our military and foreign policy where we don't have a voice at all. We have no power, no say. And only 5 million military families are really involved in this. The rest of us were otherwise preoccupied with our personal consumer choices and friendships. That's what happens when you get rid of the draft. That's what happens when you have a professional army. That's what happens when you have a distracted society. And we got to talk seriously to one another, face to face, not through screens. We can turn it around. The best way to deal with these foreign disasters like genocide and so on is to have a permanent, professional, international, peacekeeping United Nations force. Because we are not, and I mean with adequate funding and under the UN Charter, we are not liked around the world when we invade. And our soldiers don't like to invade. And we have to realize that and stop sugarcoating it. You talk to veterans, I talk to a lot of veterans, I talk to a lot of people in the Pentagon. They say things that would make national headlines if they were given a voice. The people in OSD wanted to stop the hundreds of billions of dollars of your taxes in building the F-22. They had a lot of reasons for it. They were Muslim. We're dragging Canada into wars abroad. It used to be the leading peacekeeper in the world, Canadian peacekeeping forces. And it's just going to continue to get worse, and if we don't have a say, we're all going to pay and pay and pay. And if you think you're having a tough time now getting a job or paying your student debts, you haven't seen anything yet. If you want to look at it from a personal self-interest point of view. And I call on the law school here and other law schools to stand up for the rule of law with their advanced knowledge and their historical reflections. We want to hear from law professors. We want to hear from law school deans. Just the way Dean Erwin Griswold spoke out against McCarthyism in the 1950s, considered a very courageous act at that time. We've got to change the normal way we spend our days. Because our country and world is spinning out of control in so many ways. The forces of disintegration are far exceeding the forces of integration. And the reason why people like solid democracies, and I'm not talking about nominal democracies, crippled democracies, phony democracies, thin democracies, solid democracies bring the best out of all of us. Thank you.
We're out of time. Would you once again join me in thanking our speakers?
Joe and Bobby, boldly going where the corporate media won't.